The first thing Staff Sergeant Dmitry Volkov noticed wasn't the sound. There wasn't one. His Barrett M82A1 had spoken its deadly language across the Hindu Kush Valley, the .50 caliber round disappearing into the morning haze at 1,847 meters. Through his Leopold scope, he'd watched the Taliban commander's head snap back in that familiar crimson mist that marked another confirmed kill. But something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. "Target down," Volkov whispered into his throat mic, but his voice carried uncertainty that made his spotter, Corporal Jake Martinez, glance sideways at the Russian-born sniper who'd never missed a shot in 18 months of deployment. "Negative visual confirmation," Martinez replied, squinting through his spotting scope. "I see movement. Target is. Wait, what the hell?" 3 kilometers away, through the shimmering heat waves rising from the barren Afghanistan landscape, the Taliban commander they'd been tracking for 6 weeks was walking. Not stumbling, not crawling, walking with the casual stride of a man checking his watch. The same man whose skull should have been decorating the rocks behind him. Volkov's hands trembled as he cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent brass that clinked against the stones of their hide. 18 confirmed kills. 18 perfect shots. 18 dead enemies who'd stayed dead. His reputation in the 3rd Battalion had earned him the call sign Reaper, and Marines twice his size stepped aside when he walked past. But now, staring through his scope at an impossible sight, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his first firefight in Helmand Province: genuine fear. "Echo 7 Actual, this is Overwatch 2, Martinez spoke into the radio, his voice steady despite the confusion etched across his weathered face. "We have a situation, requesting immediate confirmation on target status." The radio crackled with static before Captain Hayes' voice cut through. "Overwatch 2, say again. Did you not engage?" Martinez looked at Volkov, whose pale blue eyes were fixed on the distant figure now entering a white Toyota pickup. The truck's engine started. They could hear it echoing across the valley despite the impossible distance. The Taliban commander climbed into the passenger seat, and through the scope, Volkov could swear the man was looking directly at him. "Engaged and missed," Martinez finally replied, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. In sniper culture, missing wasn't just failure, it was professional death. But lying about a kill was worse than missing. It was cowardice. The white Toyota pulled away, disappearing behind a ridge that Volkov had memorized down to every boulder and scrub brush. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to mock their position. Somewhere in the distance, a jet's contrail scratched across the endless Afghan sky. What they didn't know was that 40,000 feet above them, another set of eyes had been watching the entire engagement through a targeting pod display. Eyes that belonged to someone who understood exactly what had just happened, and why the impossible shot they just witnessed would change everything about this war. Someone whose own impossible story was about to intersect with theirs in ways that would make Volkov's missed shot seem like the least mysterious thing that happened that day. Captain Orlaya Ghost Castillo had been orbiting in her F-16C Fighting Falcon for 3 hours, providing overwatch for ground operations in the Korengal Valley. Her Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engine hummed with mechanical precision as she maintained a lazy figure-8 pattern at Angels 40. The morning light streaming through her HUD painted golden highlights across her flight suit, and for a moment, she allowed herself to appreciate the stark beauty of the Hindu Kush Mountains stretching endlessly below. "Viper 7, this is Overwatch 2, the radio crackled in her helmet. "We need eyes on a white Toyota heading north from grid 8749. Orlaya banked left, her practiced hands guiding the Fighting Falcon through a gentle turn that would bring her targeting pod to bear on the designated coordinates. At 32, she'd been flying combat missions for 8 years, accumulating over 2,400 flight hours and earning a reputation for surgical precision that made ground commanders specifically request her for close air support. But today felt different. The morning briefing had been rushed, intelligence sparse, and her usual wingman had been grounded with a maintenance issue. "Copy, Overwatch 2. Switching to targeting pod," she replied, her voice calm and professional despite the nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right about this mission. Her left hand moved across the HOTAS controls with muscle memory, bringing the AN-ASQ-213 harm targeting system online. The pod's display flickered to life on her right multifunction display, revealing the valley floor in crisp detail. She could see Overwatch 2's position on a ridgeline, two figures prone behind what looked like a Barrett rifle system. Her targeting pod's camera followed their line of sight across the valley to where a white pickup truck was indeed moving north along a dirt road. "Visual on white Toyota," she transmitted. "Two occupants heading north on Route Silver. You want me to paint it?" There was a pause before Martinez's voice came back, loaded with something that sounded almost like embarrassment. "Negative on immediate engagement. We need positive identification on occupants first." Orlia frowned behind her oxygen mask. Positive identification from 40,000 feet. Even with her targeting pod's impressive resolution, facial recognition at this altitude was like trying to read a newspaper through binoculars. She was about to query the unusual request when her radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with multiple contacts. "Viper 7, this is Crown," came the voice of the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft providing airspace control. "We're painting multiple fast movers heading your way from the north. Count 6 contacts, altitude unknown, bearing 010 at 90 miles. 6 aircraft. In this part of Afghanistan, that could only mean one thing. Someone was launching a coordinated strike, and it wasn't friendly. Orlia's training kicked in automatically as she began running through defensive procedures, but her eyes kept drifting back to the targeting pod display. The white Toyota had stopped, and both occupants had gotten out. Through the thermal imaging, she could see one figure pointing directly up at her aircraft. Not at the sky, at her. The F-16's threat detection systems remained silent, indicating no radar lock from surface-to-air missiles, but the hair on the back of Orlia's neck stood up anyway. In 8 years of combat flying, she'd learned to trust those instincts more than any electronic system. "Crown, Viper 7 is defensive," she called out, pulling her aircraft into a climbing turn that would give her both altitude and maneuvering room. The G-forces pressed her deeper into her ejection seat as the Fighting Falcon responded with the eager agility that had made it a favorite among pilots for 4 decades. Below her, the white Toyota began moving again, but something about its movement pattern made her pause. It wasn't fleeing or seeking cover. It was tracing a perfect circle in the desert sand. That's when Captain Orlia Castillo realized this mission had just become something far more dangerous than a routine close air support sortie. The 6 inbound contacts on her radar weren't showing up on any friendly aircraft tracking system. The ground team's missed shot defied physics, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice was whispering that she'd just become part of something that would either make her career or end it. The first of the 6 contacts appeared on her radar at 50 miles, climbing through 20,000 feet at a rate that made her blood run cold. Whatever was coming her way was moving faster than anything in the known inventory of regional air forces. Orlia Ghost, Castillo had earned her call sign during her second deployment to Iraq, when she'd slipped an entire flight of F-16s through a Syrian air defense network so quietly that enemy radar operators later claimed their systems had malfunctioned. She developed an almost supernatural ability to disappear from electronic detection while maintaining perfect tactical awareness, a skill that had saved more ground troops than anyone bothered to count. But as her RWR started painting threat indicators across her HUD display, Ghost realized she might need more than stealth to survive the next 10 minutes. The 6 contacts were still climbing, now showing at 35 miles and maintaining formation in a way that suggested either exceptional pilot training or something else entirely. "Crown, Viper 7. Request immediate vector to nearest friendly base and tanker support, she transmitted, her voice maintaining the crisp professionalism that concealed years of combat experience. Her fuel gauge showed 30 minutes of loiter time remaining, but if this turned into a running fight, she'd need every drop. Viper 7 Crown. Nearest recovery field is Bagram, bearing 270 at 140 miles. Be advised, tanker support is negative at this time. All assets are committed to ongoing operations. 140 miles. With unknown contacts closing from the north and no tanker support, Ghost was looking at a tactical situation that could go from manageable to catastrophic in seconds. She'd trained for this scenario hundreds of times in simulators, but simulator threats didn't behave like whatever was painting her radar scope right now. Her left thumb found the sensor management switch, cycling through radar modes as she tried to get a clearer picture of what was approaching. The contacts were maintaining perfect formation at an altitude that kept them just below the engagement envelope of most surface-to-air missile systems, but high enough to avoid visual identification from ground observers. Professional, deliberate, definitely not Taliban. Overwatch 2, Viper 7, she called down to the sniper team. What's your status down there? I'm showing multiple inbound contacts that might be interested in your position. Martinez's voice came back immediately, but she could hear tension bleeding through his usual calm. Viper 7, we've lost visual on primary target. Truck disappeared behind ridge line about 2 minutes ago. We're beginning movement to alternate position. Ghost checked her targeting pod display and saw the two-man sniper team beginning to pack their equipment. Even at maximum zoom, they looked like ants moving across the mountainside, but their tactical discipline was evident in every movement. These weren't weekend warriors. They moved with the precision of operators who'd done this dance before. The lead contact reached 25 miles, and Ghost's threat warning system finally got a solid lock on its profile. What she saw made her stomach drop. The radar signature was consistent with an aircraft roughly the size of an F-16, but moving at speeds that suggested thrust-to-weight ratios beyond anything in current American inventory. Crown, Viper 7. I need to know what kind of aircraft we're dealing with here. These guys are flying performance parameters that don't match known threat aircraft. There was a pause before Crown responded, and when the controller's voice came back, it carried an edge that made Ghost's blood run cold. Viper 7, Crown. We're showing the same anomalous readings on our scopes. Be advised, those contacts are not squawking any known IFF codes, and they're not responding to radio challenges on guard frequency. 20 miles. Ghost could see them now on her radar display. 6 contacts in perfect formation, climbing through 38,000 feet and showing no signs of leveling off. Her F-16's radar was painting them clearly now, and what she saw defied everything she knew about aerodynamics and aircraft performance. They were accelerating, uphill, in formation, at an altitude where most aircraft would be struggling to maintain level flight. These contacts were gaining speed like they were diving through sea-level air. The radio crackled with a new voice, one that carried the authority of senior command. All aircraft, this is Sabre 6 Actual. We have declared DEFCON 3 for this sector. All friendly aircraft are directed to maintain maximum separation from unknown contacts and report any visual identification immediately. DEFCON 3. In 8 years of flying combat missions, Ghost had never heard that alert level declared for air contacts over Afghanistan. It meant someone very high up the chain of command was taking these unknowns seriously enough to risk a diplomatic incident by scrambling additional interceptors. Her fuel gauge now showed 22 minutes remaining. The math was getting ugly fast. That's when her radar warning receiver screamed. Lock on, multiple systems, and the electronic signature wasn't anything in her threat identification library. Ghost's hands moved across her controls with practiced efficiency as training took over from conscious thought. Chaff and flare dispensers armed, electronic countermeasures active, throttle to military power as the F-100 turbofan spooled up to maximum thrust. Sabre 6 actual, Viper 7 is spiked, multiple unknown radar locks, going defensive and egressing to the south. The G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat as she pulled the Fighting Falcon into a diving turn that would take her away from the approaching contacts, while maintaining enough energy to maneuver if things went kinetic. At 30,000 feet and climbing through 400 knots, her F-16 should have been untouchable by anything flying in this part of the world. Should have been. Her RWR was painting tracking radars that matched no known system in the threat database, operating on frequencies that suggested technology at least a generation ahead of current American capabilities. The contacts were still climbing, now showing at 15 miles and maintaining formation discipline that would have impressed a Thunderbird's demonstration pilot. Through her canopy, Ghost caught her first visual glimpse of what was pursuing her. 6 aircraft, dark against the morning sky, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics she'd spent 8 years learning to work around. They weren't just fast, they were impossibly agile, banking and turning in formation like dolphins swimming through air instead of water. Her targeting radar tried to lock onto the lead aircraft, but couldn't maintain contact for more than a few seconds at a time. It was as if they were there and not there simultaneously, solid enough to reflect radar energy, but somehow slippery in a way that defied electronic tracking. Crown Viper 7 has visual on unknowns. Count 6 aircraft, dark configuration, unknown type. There. They're flying like nothing I've ever seen before. Copy Viper 7. Can you identify aircraft type? Ghost stared through her HUD at the approaching formation, her pilot's brain trying to catalog what she was seeing. Wings that seemed to change shape subtly as she watched. Engines that produced no visible exhaust plume despite the obvious thrust output. A fuselage design that incorporated curves and angles in ways that hurt her eyes to focus on. Negative Crown, unknown configuration. Repeat, unknown configuration. The lead aircraft broke from formation, and Ghost's blood turned to ice water as it accelerated toward her at a rate that should have torn it apart from G-forces. Her airspeed indicator showed her F-16 pushing through 500 knots in a shallow dive, but the unknown was closing the gap like she was standing still. Her threat warning receiver fell silent. In the sudden electronic quiet, Ghost realized she was about to become part of something much larger than a routine combat air patrol over Afghanistan. Whatever was flying toward her represented technology that didn't exist in any classification manual, being operated by pilots whose skills made her 8 years of combat experience feel like kindergarten finger painting. The radio crackled with a transmission on guard frequency, and the voice that came through made her hands freeze on the controls. It was speaking English, but with an accent she couldn't place, and words that made no sense in context. Ghost Rider, you are flying in restricted airspace. Adjust heading to 270 and maintain current altitude. Do not deviate from assigned corridor. Nobody used her real call sign except her squadron mates, and nobody knew she was in this particular piece of sky except Crown Control and the ground team she'd been supporting. Nobody human, anyway. Ghost's fuel gauge showed 18 minutes. The lead unknown was now less than 2 miles behind her and closing fast. Her F-16's radar warning receiver remained stubbornly silent, as if whatever was pursuing her had suddenly become invisible to every electronic system she carried. She was about to make a decision that would either save her life or end her career, when her radio crackled with a transmission from the ground team she'd been supporting. Viper 7, Overwatch 2. We've got eyes on your situation from ground level. You need to know something about those aircraft you're dealing with. something that's going to sound completely insane. Martinez's voice carried a note of desperate urgency that made Ghost's skin crawl. In sniper culture, panic was considered a terminal disease. If a man trained to put bullets through targets at extreme range was rattled enough to break radio protocol, the situation had already moved beyond normal tactical parameters. Go ahead, Overwatch 2. Those aircraft, we're tracking them through thermal scopes and they're not showing heat signatures from engine exhaust. They're flying, but they're not burning fuel. Repeat, no thermal signature on engine output. Impossible. Every aircraft Ghost had ever flown or fought against produced massive thermal signatures from engine exhaust. Even advanced stealth fighters couldn't completely mask their heat output, especially not at the performance levels these unknowns were demonstrating. She glanced at her own engine temperature gauges, watching the familiar pattern of heat output from her Pratt & Whitney turbofan. Then she looked back through her canopy at the lead unknown, now close enough that she could see details of its configuration that made her question everything she knew about aeronautical engineering. No visible exhaust plume, no heat shimmer from engine output, no condensation trails despite the altitude and atmospheric conditions that should have produced contrails visible from 50 miles away. The aircraft was flying in defiance of thermodynamics, and her pilot's brain simply couldn't process what that meant. Overwatch 2, are you absolutely certain about that thermal reading? Confirmed, Viper 7. We've got two different thermal imaging systems painting the same result. Those things are running cold. Whatever's keeping them airborne, it's not burning fossil fuel. Ghost's threat warning receiver suddenly came alive with a lock-on tone that made her blood freeze. Not the familiar warble of radar-guided missiles, but something else entirely. A pure, musical note that seemed to resonate through her helmet and into her bones. The lead unknown aircraft was now less than half a mile behind her, flying formation on her left wing with a precision that would have impressed her old instructor pilots. Through her peripheral vision, she could see details of its design that belonged in science fiction rather than combat aviation. Smooth, organic curves that seemed to flow like liquid metal. Control surfaces that moved with subtle adjustments that suggested flight control systems beyond anything in current military inventory. And cockpit windows that were dark enough that she couldn't see inside, but somehow gave the impression of eyes watching her with ancient patience. Her radio crackled with that same accented voice. Ghost Rider, you will adjust heading to 270 immediately. This is your final warning. Final warning. In 8 years of combat flying, Ghost had received plenty of warnings from enemy aircraft, surface-to-air missile sites, and ground-based air defense systems. But this felt different. This felt personal, as if whatever was flying beside her knew exactly who she was and had been looking for her specifically. Her fuel gauge showed 15 minutes. Bagram Air Base was still 90 miles away. The math was getting worse by the minute, and she was running out of options that didn't involve either surrendering to unknown aircraft or risking an engagement with technology that made her F-16 look like a World War II biplane. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Instead of turning toward the heading the unknown aircraft had specified, Ghost pulled her F-16 into a climbing left turn that would take her directly toward the formation of remaining unknowns. If these things were going to force her into compliance, she was going to make them work for it. Her radar warning receiver went silent again as she turned directly toward the threat, and for a moment, Ghost felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with committing to combat. But as her nose came around to bear on the unknown formation, something happened that made her question whether she was still living in the same universe she'd woken up in that morning. The 5 remaining unknown aircraft simply weren't there anymore. Not destroyed, not departed, gone, as if they'd never existed. Her radar scope was clean except for the single contact that had been flying on her wing, and that aircraft was now accelerating away at a rate that would have killed any human pilot from G-forces alone. In less than 30 seconds, she went from being surrounded by impossible aircraft to flying alone in empty sky, with nothing but her fuel gauge and the distant mountains of Afghanistan to keep her company. The radio was silent. Her threat warning receiver was silent. Even the background static that normally filled her helmet speakers had disappeared, leaving her in a pocket of electronic quiet that felt more ominous than any missile lock she'd ever experienced. Ghost checked her navigation display and realized she was exactly where the unknown aircraft had wanted her to be, heading 270 at 38,000 feet, with a clear corridor to Bagram Air Base and enough fuel to make the approach with minimal reserves. Somehow, without firing a shot or making an overt threat, 6 unknown aircraft had managed to vector her exactly where they wanted her to go. And she was just now beginning to understand that whatever had just happened was only the opening move in a game whose rules she didn't understand. Her radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Viper 7, Crown, we show you clean and heading for home plate. What's your status up there?" Ghost looked around her cockpit at instruments that were functioning normally, fuel gauges that showed exactly what they should show, and threat displays that painted a completely benign tactical picture. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be for a routine combat air patrol returning from station. Except for the memory of 6 impossible aircraft that had appeared and vanished like digital ghosts, leaving nothing behind but questions that she knew no one would believe if she reported them through official channels. "Crown Viper 7, mission complete, returning to base, all systems normal." But as she began her descent toward Bagram, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that her real mission was just beginning. Ghost touched down at Bagram Air Base with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, her F-16's wheels kissing the runway with the gentle precision that marked a pilot comfortable with tight margins. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the sprawling military installation that had become home to thousands of American personnel over the past decade of operations in Afghanistan. As she taxied toward the flight line, Ghost ran through the standard post-flight procedures with automatic precision while her mind wrestled with the impossible events of the past hour. The aircraft felt solid and familiar beneath her hands, every switch and gauge exactly where they should be, every system responding with the predictable reliability she'd come to trust over thousands of flight hours. But the memory of those 6 unknown aircraft refused to fade, and the questions they raised were eating at her professional confidence like acid. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was waiting beside her parking spot with the usual post-flight checklist and a thermos of coffee that had become their ritual after long sorties. Rodriguez had been turning wrenches on F-16s for 12 years, and his weathered hands could diagnose mechanical problems by listening to engine sounds from half a mile away. "How'd she treat you up there, ma'am?" Rodriguez asked as Ghost began her shutdown procedure, his practiced eyes scanning the aircraft for signs of stress or damage. "Clean flight, Rodriguez. No discrepancies to report." The words came automatically, but Ghost hesitated before signing the maintenance logbook. In 8 years of flying, she'd never filed a false maintenance report, but how could she document an encounter with aircraft that defied physics? As she climbed down from the cockpit, Ghost's legs felt unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the normal effects of sustained G-forces. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cockpit's environmental system functioning normally, and her hands were trembling slightly as she pulled off her helmet and gloves. "You look like you've seen a ghost, ma'am," Rodriguez observed with the easy familiarity of a senior NCO who'd worked with enough pilots to recognize the signs of a rattled aviator. "Everything okay up there?" Ghost almost laughed at the unintentional irony of his comment. "Just a long patrol, Rodriguez. Nothing a hot shower and some real food won't fix." But as she walked across the flight line toward the squadron operations building, Ghost knew that neither hot water nor mess hall food would wash away what she'd experienced. The questions were already multiplying in her mind. Who had been flying those aircraft? How had they known her call sign? Why had they been so interested in the ground operation she'd been supporting? And why did she have the distinct impression that she'd just been tested? The operations building hummed with the familiar background noise of military aviation, radio chatter from ongoing missions, the whisper of air conditioning systems, the steady click of computer keyboards as intelligence analysts processed the endless stream of data that modern warfare generated. Ghost had spent thousands of hours in similar buildings across multiple deployments, but today the familiar environment felt somehow foreign. Major Sarah Chen, the squadron intelligence officer, looked up from a classified computer terminal as Ghost approached the debrief station. Chen was a former Air Force Academy graduate whose analytical mind had earned her a reputation for connecting dots that other intelligence analysts missed. If anyone could make sense of what Ghost had experienced, it would be Chen. "How was the patrol, Ghost?" Chen asked, her fingers already moving across the keyboard to bring up the mission debrief template. "We tracked your flight path on the scope, but we lost your transponder signal for about 15 minutes. Any technical issues?" 15 minutes. Ghost felt her stomach drop as she realized that the encounter with the unknown aircraft had lasted much longer than she'd initially thought. Her internal clock had suggested 10 minutes at most, but 15 minutes represented a significant gap in her tactical awareness. "Negative on technical issues," Ghost replied carefully. "But I did have an interesting encounter that I need to discuss with someone who has access to classified threat databases." Chen's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, and she looked up with the focused attention that Ghost had seen her bring to high-priority intelligence briefings. "What kind of encounter?" Ghost took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would either validate her experience or mark the beginning of the end of her flying career. Military aviation had no tolerance for pilots who reported encounters with unidentified aircraft, unless those reports came with hard evidence like radar tracks, gun camera footage, or multiple witness confirmation. "I had visual and radar contact with 6 unknown aircraft that demonstrated flight performance beyond current threat assessments," Ghost began, choosing her words carefully. "They operated in formation, maintained electronic discipline, and displayed technology that doesn't match any aircraft in our database." Chen's expression shifted subtly, and Ghost recognized the look of an intelligence officer who had just heard something that triggered red flags in multiple databases. "Did you get any visual identification, configuration details, electronic signatures?" "All of the above. But Chen, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound completely insane." For the next 20 minutes, Ghost provided a detailed account of her encounter with the unknown aircraft, from the initial radar contact through the final disappearance that had left her alone in empty sky. Chen listened without interruption, taking notes on a classified laptop and occasionally asking for clarification on technical details. When Ghost finished her account, the intelligence officer leaned back in her chair, with an expression that suggested she was processing information that went far beyond the scope of a routine mission debrief. "Ghost, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Chen said finally, her voice carrying the weight of classified information that could reshape national security priorities. "You're not the first pilot to report encounters with unknown aircraft demonstrating impossible flight performance. In fact, you're the 7th this month." 7 encounters in 1 month. Ghost felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as she realized that her experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that someone in the intelligence community was clearly tracking. "What kind of aircraft are we dealing with?" Ghost asked. Chen's response made her blood run cold. "We don't know, but whoever's flying them seems to be specifically interested in our most experienced combat pilots. The debrief session with Major Chen lasted another 2 hours, during which Ghost learned that her encounter with unknown aircraft was part of what the intelligence community had classified as Pattern Omega, a series of incidents involving advanced aircraft that demonstrated technology beyond current American capabilities. The classification level meant that fewer than 50 people in the entire military had access to the full scope of information, and Ghost's security clearance barely qualified her for the basic briefing that Chen was authorized to provide. The encounters started 6 months ago, Chen explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the secure nature of their conversation. Always targeting single aircraft, always involving our most experienced pilots, and always ending with the unknown aircraft directing our people to specific flight corridors. Ghost thought about her forced heading change to 270 and the way the unknown aircraft had vanished once she'd complied. They're hurting us, but toward what? That's the question that's keeping a lot of people in Washington awake at night, Chen replied. We've identified 7 previous encounters, all involving pilots with combat experience comparable to yours. 2 F-16 pilots, 3 F-18 pilots, 1 B-1 bomber crew, and an A-10 pilot who reported being escorted to a landing field in Iraq by 4 unknown aircraft that vanished before ground personnel could get visual confirmation. The pattern was becoming clear, and Ghost didn't like what it suggested. Someone with access to advanced aerospace technology was selectively engaging American military aircraft, specifically targeting experienced pilots and demonstrating capabilities that made current American air superiority doctrine obsolete. What does Command want us to do if we encounter these aircraft again? Ghost asked. Chen's expression grew even more serious. As of yesterday, any pilot reporting contact with Pattern Omega aircraft is to be immediately reassigned to stateside duties pending a comprehensive security review. The thinking is that we can't risk losing experienced combat pilots to whatever game these unknowns are playing. Reassignment to stateside duties. For a pilot like Ghost, who had spent 8 years building a reputation for tactical excellence in combat zones, it might as well have been a career death sentence. But the alternative, remaining in theater while unknown aircraft with superior technology hunted American pilots, wasn't exactly appealing either. Chen, I need you to understand something, Ghost said, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her one of the most requested close air support pilots in theater. Whatever those aircraft were, they didn't feel hostile. Threatening, yes. Superior, absolutely. But not hostile. It felt more like an evaluation. An evaluation for what? I don't know. But I got the distinct impression that they were testing my reactions, my decision-making, maybe my willingness to engage unknown contacts. Like they were gathering data on how American pilots respond to encounters with superior technology. Chen made additional notes on her classified laptop, and Ghost could see the intelligence officer's mind working through the implications of what she just heard. If the unknown aircraft were indeed conducting evaluations of American pilot capabilities, it suggested a level of strategic planning that went far beyond random encounters with experimental technology. Ghost, there's one more thing you need to know, Chen said finally. The pilot who reported the encounter in Iraq, the A-10 driver, he said something that matches what you just told me. He said it felt like a test. And he said the unknown aircraft seemed to know things about him that weren't in any public record. His call sign, his combat history, even details about missions that were still classified. The same chill Ghost had felt when the unknown aircraft had called her Ghost Rider ran down her spine again. If these aircraft had access to classified American military personnel records, the security implications went far beyond advanced aerospace technology. Chen, what if we're looking at this backwards? Ghost said, the pieces of a larger puzzle starting to assemble in her mind. What if these aren't foreign aircraft at all? What if they're ours? The intelligence officer's expression went carefully blank in the way that suggested Ghost had just stumbled onto information that was classified several levels above her clearance. That's a theory that's been considered at the highest levels, Chen said carefully. But the technology demonstrated in these encounters is beyond anything in current American development programs. Current programs that you know about, Ghost corrected. Chen, I've been flying military aircraft for 8 years, and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of what was possible within the laws of physics. But what I saw today made me question whether I know anything about aerospace technology at all. Their conversation was interrupted by the squadron operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, who appeared at their table with the purposeful stride of a senior officer carrying urgent orders. Captain Castillo, you're needed in the classified briefing room immediately, Martinez said, his expression revealing nothing about the nature of the summons. Major Chen, you're to accompany her and bring all materials related to her mission debrief. As they walked toward the classified briefing room, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with the unknown aircraft had been the opening move in a game whose stakes were much higher than air superiority over Afghanistan. The questions that had started with 6 impossible aircraft were multiplying into a web of classified programs, national security implications, and technology that challenged everything she thought she knew about the limits of human engineering. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had those aircraft been so interested in her specifically? And what did they want her to do with the information she'd gathered during their encounter? The classified briefing room at Bagram contained 3 people Ghost didn't recognize, all wearing civilian clothes that screamed intelligence community, despite the lack of name tags or rank insignia. The senior member of the group, a silver-haired woman who carried herself with the authority of decades spent in classified programs, stood as Ghost and Major Chen entered. Captain Castillo, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the woman said, extending her hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to command briefings at the highest levels. We need to discuss your encounter with Pattern Omega aircraft, and I'm afraid the conversation will require expanding your security clearance to include compartmented information that goes well beyond normal operational parameters. Ghost felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Warren gestured for her to take a seat at the conference table. Compartmented information meant special access programs, the kind of classified projects that existed in the shadows of the defense budget and involved technology that wouldn't see public acknowledgement for decades, if ever. Doctor, before we begin, I need to know whether I'm in trouble for engaging unknown aircraft without authorization, Ghost said, her pilot's instinct for direct communication overriding diplomatic niceties. Dr. Warren's smile suggested she'd worked with military personnel long enough to appreciate straight talk. Captain, you're not in trouble. You're here because your encounter provides crucial data for understanding a phenomenon that threatens to fundamentally alter the balance of global air power. The second member of the team, a younger man whose soft appearance couldn't quite conceal the sharp intelligence behind his glasses, opened a laptop and began pulling up files that made Ghost's security training alarm bells ring. The classification markings were unlike anything she'd seen before, with compartment designations that suggested programs so highly classified that their existence was known to fewer than a dozen people. Captain Castillo, what you encountered today represents technology that is approximately 30 to